My name is Jocelyn Clark. I'm an editor at The Lancet in London, a medical journal that's very interested in health and medicine broadly, and recently has undertaken a large project looking at death and dying. We've come together to talk about the medicalization of death. And we have a wonderful group of panelists and my colleague, Richard Smith.
Yeah, so I'm Richard Smith. I'm defined primarily by what I'm not. I used to be the editor of the BMJ, but I'm not anymore, which of course is a great rival of the Lancet. And I'm not Arthur Smith, but I'm his brother, a rather poor substitute, unfortunately. And the Lancet has many of these commissions, as they're called. It sounds rather grand. They've already had one on palliative care. They have one, ours is on the value of death. And there's a parallel one that's going on with the Vatican, of all unlikely organisations, on the value of life. I think we see the two as complementary. And we're here in Bristol because we've been very generously funded by the 4 universities of the west of England. And we've been meeting today with a lot of academics, and they've given us many, many ideas. But we're hoping to get more ideas from you. So most of this, we hope, at least half of it, will be a conversation once we've grilled these 4 people.
So we have 2 outstanding friends and colleagues, all authors of recent books on the topic, joining us this evening. And they are Stephanie Nemo, who's a writer and, as she describes it, an expert on death from lived experience, who has written a book and will tell us about that this evening. And Mark O'Connell, who's a journalist and the author of a very compelling book, To Be a Machine. Can't wait to hear more about it. And Seamus O'Mahony, a gastroenterologist from Cork, Ireland, who has written a book called The Way We Die Now. So I'd like to ask first, Stephanie, if you might tell us about your work and your recent book.
Can you hear me? I'll make this really brief. I've been told to make it really brief. It's quite difficult making my story brief. I'm Stephanie Nemo. I'm a writer from London. Up until December 2004, I was just your average sort of suburban businesswoman with 3 kids, juggling a multinational career. And then my 4th child, Daisy, was born, and she was born with a very sporadic, rare gene mutation that caused a rare genetic disease, and we were told from day one she was going to be life limited. And my world changed, upside down, completely sporadic gene mutation, career ended, and I was parachuted into the world of medical world, and had to come up to speed very, very quickly. We had to accept very, very early on that our daughter, who we were mourning the loss of the child we thought we were expecting and growing to love this child who we had been given, was also going to die very young. And so we were living in the shadow of death, not knowing when she was going to die or how, but knowing that she would not reach adulthood. Along that pathway, I had 3 other kids who were 7, 5 and 2 when Daisy was born. My 2 boys were diagnosed with autism, which was another whole story altogether. And then, out of the blue, just as we were kind of getting our heads around it, and we had decided to kind of metaphorically take off our seatbelts from this speeding vehicle and enjoy the ride and enjoy our time with Daisy and make the most of our precious time with her, my husband was diagnosed with terminal cancer. But interestingly, Daisy had taught us how to die because she had taught us how to have conversations about death and to understand that the only thing we have guaranteed in life is that we are going to die. Andy lived for a year after Daisy, and it was an incredible year, and we discussed his funeral, and he died at home, as was his wish. And then I had to regroup again with my 4 kids, and I started writing my book to try and capture it, because it was just a world that I think people needed to know about. And during the writing of the book, Daisy deteriorated, and she ended up on life support and intensive care in Great Ormond Street. I had to make the decision to switch off her ventilator a year after her daddy had died, and I told her to go and dance in the stars with her daddy. And so I have now regrouped again. I'm the mum of 3 kids. We have very open conversations about death and dying. I wrote the book, Was This in the Plan? Because none of us knows what is in the plan. And as my husband said, it's not the cards you dealt, it's how you play them. So I now spend a lot of my time campaigning, trying to reframe a lot of the narrative around death and dying, and particularly around paediatric palliative care, specifically in light of some of the very high-profile cases.
Stephanie, can I ask you, we were talking earlier about just because you can do something doesn't mean you necessarily could, but I can imagine if you've got a very sick child and needs lots of things done to them, how can you say no as a mother?
It's, moral dilemma doesn't even sum it up, does it? You know, the umbilical cord is there. And it all came down to measuring quality of life, but how do you measure quality of life? And for us, we knew the things that were important for Daisy were to be able to go to school when she could, to see her friends, see her, and to have fun. And we knew as long as we could enable that, that was our measure. So there were certain things that we could do, but my husband and I had very open conversations about at what point do we then say tracheostomy or, you know, other things. But yes, I really feel passionately that there were, and then we explored lots of options. There were things that can be done for a child like Daisy who had complete intestinal failure, like transplants, but they weren't the right option for Daisy. So just because, you know, it can be done didn't mean it was the right thing for her. But we had to make some decisions that, you know, no parent should ever have to face, but they were all based on trying to advocate for our daughter and just enable her to have a childhood. And basically what happened at the end, that window of quality of life disappeared, and I knew it was her time. And I'd always said to the consultants, I'll know, and Daisy would tell us, and she very clearly did. She chose her time. It was actually very poignant, very powerful.
One of the things, Stephanie, that you said in your opening remarks that I found very compelling is that your husband's journey and dying taught you how to have conversations about Daisy's death. And we've talked about today, and some of us will have seen in the media, that there was a new report from the Royal College of Physicians that described actually how poor doctors and other health professionals tend to be in having those conversations about dying. What have these experiences taught you about that, and what do we all need to learn about improving those conversations?
I think this is, I mean, my kids are always saying, oh, God, this mum, I'm talking about death again, but actually it's a really important thing. We talk about, you know, everything. I say in school, the one thing that's not on the curriculum that is guaranteed to happen to every single child is death. We don't talk about FGM, bullying, we don't talk about death on the national curriculum. Why? Because we were presented from a very early age with the fact that our child was not going to live till adulthood, and that's stark facts, it really sharpened our thinking and made us understand that our time together was so finite, and made us reflect on our own lives, that this completely random, sporadic gene mutation had actually opened our eyes to the fact that we were going to have to really enjoy the small things and get on with life. So, as I say, when Andy was diagnosed with cancer, it was almost we were there in the moment, and we were having very, very open conversations, and having conversations about funerals, wills, lasting powers of attorney. My kids have all signed the organ donation register, and they signed it from a very early age because they spent so much time in hospital with children who were waiting for hearts and lungs. They knew that if you're 7 and you're waiting for a heart, that has to be donated by another child the same height. And how would you feel as a parent giving the okay if your child died suddenly to donate their heart because you've happily received a donated heart? Those sort of conversations need to be had, which is why I put myself out there when I could just be sitting at home in my widow's weeds. But I think it's so important to break down these taboos around conversations around death and dying. At what point did we suddenly become scared about something that is actually going to happen to all of us?
And Stephanie, I've got another question. I asked you if I could ask this beforehand, but I wondered how the cost of looking after Daisy was enormous.
Yeah.
How did you feel about that? Did that worry you? Or?
I was told on not more than one occasion that Daisy's the most expensive child in our borough. Her care package costs thousands, you know, and I have guilt, you know, and then her bags of TPN, the total parenteral nutrition that kept her alive, they would cost £500 a day. She had one bag a day for every day of the year for 12 years of her life. You know, I don't know, add it up. Yes, there is a cost, there is a finite pot of money, but also I was aware that, you know, we were giving Daisy a quality of life. We weren't prolonging death. And it's a really, really tricky one. And, you know, also I fought so hard to learn all the procedures that would allow me to bring Daisy home. And then I had to fight to get a care package to support me because I was on my knees. So when my husband was diagnosed with cancer, I was given additional help. I was given night nurses, I was allowed to sleep. And then after he died, the clinical commissioning group came in and said, well, now your husband's died, we need to review your care package. The implication being, they've got one less person to care for. There is always going to be a cost associated with a complex condition that you're living with, and that is just going to go on and on because the more medical science progresses, people are living longer because of interventions, and there has to be a decision that has to be made at some point. How much do you intervene? And I think we were very clear as a family how much we would intervene.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
So Mark, to you and your journey discovering immortality to be a machine, will you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so my book, To Be a Machine, I wrote over the course of about 1.5 to 2 years. I spent spending time with sort of immersing myself in the ideas of a movement known as transhumanism. Transhumanism is essentially a social movement that is predicated on the idea that it's possible and also desirable that we should use technology to sort of push out the boundaries of the human condition. So it involves all sorts of different speculative ideas, things like enhancing our sort of cognitive capabilities through implants, merging with artificial intelligence, and so on, enhancing our bodily capabilities, but really the sort of end point for most transhumanists is really conquering death and sort of incrementally expanding lifespans and to the point of immortality, really. So there are various kinds of therapies and ideas that surround this. One of them is, I mean, I spent time sort of mainly in the US looking into these various technologies and the people who are advocating them. And one of the first things I did was I spent time in a cryonics facility in Arizona. For people who don't know, cryonics is the science, or really more accurately, the pseudoscience of sort of preserving bodies shortly after the point of death, with a view to, at some point in the future, when the technology becomes feasible, bringing people back to life. And so most people have their heads frozen rather than their bodies because it's cheaper and the storage space is less, there's less demand on storage space and stuff like that. The sort of end point for most transhumanists would be actually transcending the human body entirely as a means of not just evading death, but actually evading humanity itself, sort of transcending biology, I suppose. And so the big idea here is something called a singularity, whereby we, at a certain point in the future, there are various different sort of ideas as to when this might be possible. It could be sort of 50 years' time, it could be 1,000 years' time, depending on who you're talking to. But the idea is that we would, like artificial intelligence is going to get so powerful and so sophisticated that at a certain point in the future it becomes inevitable that we merge with AI and become these kind of immortal, godlike creatures. So, I mean, this is a very extreme set of ideas and philosophies, and you know, some people sort of talk about it as though it's a religion. There's something to that, I think, but it's important to recognize that this is a set of ideas that has a serious constituency among quite powerful and influential people in Silicon Valley, particularly. Maybe unsurprisingly, Silicon Valley is where I spent most of my time when I was researching this book. And so the Google founders have a company called Calico, which is a biotech company aimed at finding sort of biotech solutions to what they call the problem of death. One of the strangest things I encountered when I was writing the book was a guy I met in Palo Alto who had staged a protest outside the Google campus, and he'd held up a sign saying, "Google, please solve death." So that struck me as a really sort of comic thing in a way, but also like a really stark illustration of how technology has become the sort of focus of what would traditionally have been the sort of anxieties and yearnings of religion. So yeah, that's sort of what my book is about. And there's quite a strong personal element to it as well. I'm sort of never very far from the page in the book, so that's what I've done.
And Mark, you make the point there's very serious money going into this, I mean, as from Google. And in your book, I think you sort of stay away from, are these people nutcases or actually is this deadly serious? Did you ever reach a conclusion?
No, because I think it's an irresolvable thing. I mean, I think it's a false dichotomy in a way. Like, some of the most serious people are nutcases. And one of the things that I became really preoccupied by was this sort of horizon whereby the more invested people are in the idea of reason and rationality, and transhumanists they don't think of themselves as being religious or spiritual, they see themselves as being hardline rationalists. And the more deeply invested you get in rationalism, the closer it becomes to being a kind of sort of neurotic madness in a way. So I was really interested in that in the book.
So in your sort of journey, particularly in the US, learning about these different modalities, which ones did you enjoy trying the most?
Are you having your head frozen?
Yeah. So, one of the things I did was, if you're asking like what I enjoyed like encountering the most, I enjoyed all of it actually in a way. I wasn't convinced by all of them equally or at all in a lot of cases. But I spent some time in Pittsburgh with a bunch of self-proclaimed cyborgs who design and build technologies for implanting in their own bodies to give themselves superhuman capabilities. Like in practice, they're really, really mildly superhuman capabilities. Things like the ability to open doors and so on. But those guys were really fun. And I also drove across Texas. There was a guy I met very early on when I was doing the reporting for the book called Zoltan István, who was, when I met him first, he was kind of an interloper in the transhumanist movement and was trying to sort of establish himself. But very quickly, within sort of 6 months after I met him, I'd been talking to him on the phone, and he'd been talking about, he was quite a wealthy man, he'd made a lot of money in property in San Francisco, but his wife was sort of saying it's time. His wife was a gynecologist, she worked for Planned Parenthood. She's a very practical woman, and Zoltan was a sort of a hardline transhumanist who didn't want to invest in his children's education because he figured that by the time they got to college age, you'd be able to upload the content of a hardware degree to your brain. But he decided that he was going to run for president. He announced to me that his wife had convinced him that he needed to get up off his ass and do something. So in this very American gesture, he decided that he was going to run for president. That would be what he'd do. So I drove across Texas with Zoltan and a couple of his campaign aides in a gigantic school bus that he had converted to look like a coffin, to raise awareness about the problem of death. So that was probably the funnest thing that I did.
So Mark, of course I'm a cyborg wearing glasses.
Yeah.
Isn't there almost an implicit promise in medicine that that's where we're headed? Because we're going to cure cancer, we're going to cure dementia, eventually we'll have cured everything. What are we going to die of? We're then going to live forever.
Right. Well, that's the thing. That's one of the more interesting dimensions of it, is that, when you talk to transhumanists, they're very keen to place it on a continuum with medical science. And so, there's a sense in which you can define transhumanism so broadly and so generously. You can define it as the effort to use technology and science to improve the human condition and improve lifespans and so on. So it becomes kind of, the line between transhumanism and just medicine becomes blurred. But I think, in practice, most of what I encountered was a very extreme version of that. I mean, these people just do not want to die, and they're convinced that technology will make it possible for them to live forever, which is not something that, I mean, I'm not a doctor, but it's not something that you hear most doctors.
Yeah, I think Seamus's face is sort of telling how he feels about it.
Thank you, Mark. Seamus O'Nani.
Thanks very much, Justin. I don't know if any of you have heard of Atul Gawande.
Yeah.
Oh, they're nodding really madly. Oh, yes. Think of me as a sort of low-rent Atul. Poor man's Atul Gawande is what I'd like you to think of me as. As Justin said, I wrote this book, which came out about 2.5 years ago, called The Way We Die Now. And it was the first thing that I had written for a book length for a general readership. Prior to that, my published output concerned such things as the humoral intestinal immune response in patients with dermatitis or petiformis. So anyway, why did I write this book? It comes as a bit of a surprise to most people who have no connection with healthcare and medicine and hospitals that most people in Britain and in Ireland, it's the same, die in acute hospitals, not hospices. You're 10 times more likely to die in an acute general hospital compared to a hospice. I felt that there was nothing really being written from that perspective. Most of what I came across about death and dying, contemporary sort of accounts of it from a medical perspective, were coming from the palliative care or hospice perspective. And whilst I'm a big supporter of hospice care and palliative care in general, I felt like other people that this narrative from the palliative care community was marked by what some have called a degree of chronic niceness, and that death was almost, a really fantastic spiritual experience, a journey that you'd almost want to sign up to. And I was working in a different environment, in the sort of chaos and indeed sometimes squalor of acute general hospitals, where it wasn't all nice and spiritual, and where I was increasingly concerned by what I was witnessing every day in the care or non-care and treatment of people reaching the end of life. I felt increasingly out of step with what modern medicine was doing to people at the end of life and by what my colleagues' priorities were. Another reason I wrote was that I was increasingly suspicious, and I spoke about this earlier today, about this concept of the good death, which is now being propagated very, very widely. And I felt that there was this almost a perception and indeed a consensus that a good death is something that doctors should prescribe, almost like we could prescribe a course of antibiotics. I've argued very strongly that this is somewhat delusional. And finally, I suppose this reflects my own upbringing and where I live. Ireland has gone, during my lifetime, which is very short as you can see, from a quasi-theocracy to a secular modern state. And I don't think it's entirely coincidental that 2 of the 3 panelists here are Irish. And the Irish are very good with the dead, we're fantastic with the dead, but not so good with the dying. And I wanted to kind of reflect a bit on what had happened to the death of ritual and the loss of ritual around death and dying in my own country. So those are the reasons why I wrote the book.
Seamus, in your book, you talk a lot about this sort of awakening or a struggle with thinking about futile attempts or what you have come to regard as unnecessary attempts to prolong life, but also about the kind of pressures that you as a jobbing doctor feel from patients who demand certain interventions and certain types of care. Can you talk a little bit about that and your journey about thinking about your relationship with patients who are asking you for things that you perhaps have come to believe are not appropriate?
Yeah, I would say it's more often the families of patients than the patients themselves. So I do two types of things. My specialty work is gastroenterology, which includes liver disease, and I also do general medicine, which means that you take whatever patients come in the door. They're usually very elderly, frail people. The overwhelming majority are over the age of 80. Many of them come in from nursing homes. And I came across a very disturbing statistic in my own institution, which was that in this month's, I think a period of a couple of months, 11 people died within 30 minutes of arrival in the emergency department from a nursing home. In other words, they were sent with the intent of them dying in the ED, and they died on a trolley in the ED. I audited my own experience, and about 1 in 10 people admitted acutely on what's called a general medical take will die, 1 in 10. So what I was seeing was an unrealistic expectation, particularly on the part of families of very frail elderly people. I was also witnessing a reluctance on the part of nursing homes for people to die there, and they were increasingly being sent into casualty departments, to actually die. I was worried about what I was witnessing in cancer care, where people with advanced and incurable cancers were being subjected to treatments like chemotherapy in the last weeks of their lives. I look after and continue to look after a lot of young people with chronic liver disease. There's been an epidemic in Britain and Ireland over the last 2 decades in alcohol-related liver disease. It's become a huge, huge issue, and I deal regularly with young people dying of this disease. There's a perception that because it's not cancer and because there's a thing called liver transplantation, that virtually all of this can be fixed. However, only a minority of people with this disease qualify or can be transplanted. So I was witnessing the deaths of very young people, and very often their families and indeed the patients themselves had an expectation that medicine could somehow rescue this situation, and it couldn't.
Can I ask you, Seamus, a friend of mine who actually has the same background as you, a general physician, admits patients in a general hospital. He read your book and he very much agreed with what you said about sort of excessive care and the pressure to go on, and the acute hospitals are a bad place to die. But he couldn't understand why you were against assisted suicide and advance decisions, and that he just couldn't get his head around that. I thought I could explain it to him.
Yeah, and it annoys people. I don't know how often I've talked about the book or whatever, and people come up and say, "No, I really liked your book," and I say, "Thank you very much." However, I'd like to say that I just can't understand why you're against assisted suicide. I always get this kind of cack-handed sort of apologetic sort of response, but
we don't want that now.
No, let's be bold. No, I suppose what I would say is that I've been at it for a long time, 35 years. So we had a great piss up in Killarney last month to celebrate. And I can honestly say I've never ever been in a situation where I thought to myself, damn, I wish the laws in Ireland allowed me to assist this person to end their life. I also have this suspicion that assisted suicide is a sort of preoccupation of the professional middle classes, and that it's a sort of an obsession with control, as very often people who are used to controlling every aspect of their lives feel that this is incredibly important to have this kind of control over the end of life as well. I've always felt that proper end of life and palliative care renders this unnecessary. I'm not coming at it from any particularly religious point of view, even though I was raised in a very devoutly religious environment. Perhaps that has informed my thinking on it subliminally, I don't know.
Gosh, 3 very different and very, very interesting books. So we'd like to open it up to the audience now for you to ask questions of our panelists.
Or make comments, because we're gathering stuff.
No, or make comments. So who would like to break the ice?
So I'd like to pick up on Seamus's point. You said that this was an obsession with the professional middle class. Opinion polls put it at something like 82% of people in favour of changing the law, which I think is interesting. Especially in an era of patient-centred medicine that we hear about. At the end of life, I'd have thought that would be a point where the patient's choice would have been something we should be listening to. And if that patient decides that their quality of life is never going to improve and it's beyond what they can tolerate, why should they be denied the choice for a peaceful death without having to go to Switzerland?
Thank you. Jane, just behind you, the woman with the hand up.
You have been among the fans of transhumanism, right? I'm just wondering what the sex ratio was, the ratio of females.
Excellent. Okay, I'll get one more question, please, before this. So we'll come here to the front row.
I'm just looking for a bit of help and guidance. I'm a GP, and the thing I find difficult is that even people right at the end of their lives who said to me many times, oh, I've had enough of this, don't grow old, and all those sorts of things. When it comes to it, even signing the do not resuscitation form, they express a great deal of hesitation and fear. And I find it very difficult to reassure people. I find myself asking whether they have a religious belief, and though I don't have a very strong religious belief, I'm always quite relieved when they say they have, because I feel that offers some refuge. But I'm sure in this audience there are people who are good at helping people talk about their fears and giving them real reassurance, and so I'd like some guidance on that, please.
Thank you. So Seamus, perhaps you can take the first question, Mark the second, and Stephanie, perhaps you could have a reflection on the third.
I have no personal wish to deny people if they perceive this as a right. I am not going to go out and proselytize or campaign to prevent this from becoming law at all. I've simply argued that it is a distraction, actually, from the real issues which I alluded to earlier. I think the experience of where assisted suicide has been legalized is quite interesting. If you look at Oregon, it's a very small number of people who actually take advantage of this. It's a tiny minority of people. It's rather like voting Liberal Democrat or something like that. And if that's what they want to do, by all means.
But Seamus, don't you think, much of the benefit is from, I'm not particularly, I suppose I am for it, but much of the benefit is just the possibility that you could.
Yes.
That's probably more of a benefit than the fact you do.
Yes, and a lot of people just like to have that option, and they feel that it is giving them some degree of control. And a lot of them don't actually take the lethal cocktail. I would be slightly more worried, however, by the sort of advanced nihilism of euthanasia, which is currently practiced in the Low Countries.
You asked about the gender distribution of transhumanism, and I think it would be unsurprising to hear that it's overwhelmingly male. And obviously, when I was writing the book, this was something that became quite apparent quite quickly. The first kind of encounter that I had with the transhumanist movement was in London, in Birkbeck. Actually, there was a meeting of a group called the London Futurists, and the topic of the talk was a discussion on cognitive enhancements and the distribution of cognitive enhancements. And so the whole kind of sort of gist of these ideas was that the future was going to bring these really radical changes in what it means to be human. But I looked around the auditorium and I realized that it could have been the 19th century, because it was tiered seating in a room in a college in London full of men talking about the future. And so that my experience was sort of borne out throughout the whole process of writing the book. And at a certain point, it sort of started to haunt me a little bit. Like, what actually am I writing a book about men? Am I writing a book about a specific delusion that appeals overwhelmingly to men? Why is that? And I don't really have any particular answer to that. I mean, part of it is that the tech world, I mean, transhumanism's constituency is the tech world. It's, programmers and so on. And that's quite a male milieu to begin with. But I think even more so, transhumanism is very male. And like I said, I don't really have any solid answers to why that might be, but I think there's something about the idea of, not of living forever, but of extracting the mind from the body and being like a being of pure reason and rationality that for whatever reason is more compelling to, well, not men generally, but a particular kind of man, I think. The fantasy of like just pure rationality. And I think I'm really wary of like essentializing along gender lines here, but I think in my experience, women are more comfortable with their bodies and their like condition of embodiment, and maybe also death as well. I don't know. That's a slightly wild thing to say, but
well, no, because we've heard today that in contrast, 95% of palliative care physicians are women. And as Roz, who's here, said, men don't do death and they don't do colds.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's certainly one of the most like pressing things about transhumanism is that, like, I started to ask myself, am I writing a book about men actually?
Or masculinity.
Or masculinity, yeah. Is there some kind of crisis of masculinity thing going on?
American white male masculinity.
Right, yeah. When you said it, yeah.
So, Stephanie.
Conversations, opening the conversation about preparing for death. When my husband was diagnosed, he was 51, and he died just a few weeks after his 53rd birthday, and he said to me, Steph, I have no fear and no regret. And I think we were very unusual. We were in a good place because we had had many years of conversations about death. And I think that's what it comes down to, actually preparing those conversations before they need to happen. Something that I've done quite actively, I've run some death cafes. And they are really good, and I have all sorts of people come along to them, and opening conversations. As soon as you start a couple of things, it almost opens the floodgates, allowing people permission, both professionals and patients, so from both sides, to open those conversations and talk about what would you want and how would you want to die. I mean, Andy talked about, and I said to him, where do you want to die? Do you want to go to the hospice? Because we talked about taking Daisy to the hospice. And he said, I just want to go wherever the best painkilling drugs are. And then actually, when it came down to it, he wanted to come home. And that's okay, but we've had those conversations. What I found is that I also gave our doctors, we gave our doctors permission to talk to us about Daisy dying, so we almost opened those conversations. So it becomes a meeting of both empowered patients and carers and empowered doctors to have those conversations. And sometimes people don't want to, and that's okay. But actually, sometimes when you find you empower people to open up the conversation, it's okay. When I went to plan the funeral, I remember the funeral arranger, Andy's funeral, and the funeral arranger saying to me, God, this is so good, you know what you want. She said, sometimes I sit here for a whole day with a family who are planning the death of their grandma who died at 85, and it's like they didn't realise it was going to happen. And they're so devastated, they didn't know if she was religious, if she wanted to be buried or cremated. And what is stopping us from opening up and talking about these things and just being a little bit more open and sharing? So, if you are ever see an advert for a death cafe, I really encourage you to go along. And even just having conversations that start to open up the further conversations. I would say to people, the conversation starter I always say is that, what music would you want at your funeral? Mm-hmm. And it always opens up, and then people start talking about how far they would want to go in terms of resuscitation and what they would like. and just telling your loved ones. One last little anecdote. I always tell a lot. Jim Henson, who created the Muppets, he died of sepsis, a very unexpected death. But he had written quite a few years before he died a letter, just capturing what he wanted for his end of life. He wasn't at end of life, and he also captured what he wanted for his funeral. He wanted a New Orleans jazz band. He didn't want to be kept artificially alive. There were certain things, and he did that. No one knows why he did that, but because he died unexpectedly, his family and his loved ones knew, and his physicians knew what he wanted.
I could just say, almost the implication of your question was there was some sort of magic words you could say that would make people feel better. Something we heard a lot about today from Malcolm Johnson, has studied lots of people dying in care homes, which is where most of us are going to die in the future, and talked about people suffer biographical pain. They try to make sense of their lives, they look back on their lives. And what he emphasised really was the importance not of what you say, but of listening, and kind of just letting people kind of talk and then being very kind of non-judgmental. I don't think, is he here? I don't think he is, but do you want to say a little bit about that?
I would say that there is a silent epidemic of biographical pain, of people who are facing the end of life with a lot of time on their own because they are immobilized by being frail. And in those circumstances, they're thinking about what they know best, their own lives. And those recollections will include some things that were wonderful and joyful, but they will also include a lot of things that were hurtful and damaging, and where people had done bad things to them, and they recall that they had done things of which they were deeply ashamed, and then now run out of road to put them right. And if you don't share that with anybody, and it goes round in your head again and again, because there's no way of examining it, then it becomes deeply, deeply disturbing, and a kind of continuing anguish that I've given the title Biographical Pain to, and people seem to understand it.
Thank you, Malcolm. So let's get a new round of questions. So first in the back.
It's more of a question for Seamus, but you talked about the idea of a good death, and you kind of framed it in a bad light, and I was by saying like prescribing. And I was wondering, shouldn't physicians be facilitating a good death? And given that it's quite a subjective thing, and you talk about the difference between the amount of deaths in hospital and in palliative care.
Thank you. Holly, this woman here with the glasses, just in front of you.
Hi, I just wanted to ask Stephanie about whether there was any kind of ceremony or ritual that you found helped you to be with the people that you loved while they died, or that helped them. Thank you.
Just dealing with the question of alcoholic liver disease, why has that happened? I think there's complicated reasons, but there's a few things that are certain, which we are now in the process of enshrining in law in Ireland, which is that if you limit the availability of alcohol, people drink less. If you increase the price of it, people drink less. And if you stop advertising of it, people drink less. Now, there are more complex reasons as to why there's been this dramatic explosion of alcohol consumption in young people, but certainly those are some of the reasons. I don't think it's because there is a perception amongst young people that medicine can, miraculously cure everything.
But didn't you say a minute ago that everybody thought a liver transplant would fix it?
That's the people who got it. I think the question was, if I'm 20 years old and I'm going out to have 20 vodkas tonight,
right,
do I believe that I'll be fine because medicine is going to fix that? I don't think that they have any such thoughts at all, actually. So there's a big debate has been going on in Ireland over the last few years on the involvement of the alcohol industry in sport. and about minimum unit pricing, and so on. There was a very strong political lobby group in Ireland funded by the drinks industry, which delayed this bill for as long as was possible in the Irish Parliament, but it's finally gone through. To address the topic of the good death, I'm slightly concerned about the idea that, I'm saying it can't be prescribed is slightly glib. When you try to apply sort of tick-boxable criteria to what is an incredibly individual experience, I think you're losing sight of the individual. I don't know if any of you here have heard of a thing called the Liverpool Care Pathway. This was a tick-boxable exercise which had a very good intent to provide palliative care type principles to people dying in acute general hospitals. And it had to be essentially disposed of, and the name had to be got rid of because certain stories leaked into the media about this being euthanasia by the back door and all this kind of stuff. And there was a parliamentary inquiry into it chaired by Julia Neuberger, who produced a fantastic report. And she recommended the scrapping of this sort of very tick-boxy type exercise and made the point that end-of-life care has to be individualized, and that's what I'm arguing. And that what might be good for one person is not good for somebody else. And I think that we might be going down the wrong route with these very regulated, workshopped, tick-boxable, metriced exercises. I think people are so varied and so individual that you have to treat each person individually at the end of life. I'm not against a good death. I'm against a sort of this standardization of a good death.
So perhaps Stephanie, you might take the question from our last.
So you talked about sort of ceremony around death and dying. For me, it was an incredible honour being with someone at their last breath. And I found that, and I'm not a religious person, but I did find that a deeply spiritual thing to accompany someone on their last journey, their last breath. Andy died at home. Daisy died in hospital, and it was a good death because there was an element of empowerment. But I think the most important thing was then afterwards how we engaged with the bodies. Because I think particularly in the Western world, we kind of then have this culture, we've got to ship them off to the undertaker. And, and for some people, for example, my mother wants a direct cremation. She wants to be taken from wherever her place of death is, straight away to the crematorium. That's her death, that's her choice. With Daisy, I knew that it was really important for her siblings to come to terms with the fact, because she had 3 siblings, that their sister had gone. And this was a child who was highly medicalised in life that I felt I needed to reclaim as a child before I said goodbye to her. So she died in intensive care, and then I asked to take her home. We tried to take her home. We tried to do a compassionate extubation to take her breathing tube out at home, but she was too unstable. So I asked if I could take her home, and I knew, because I was the sort of person I am, that it was possible to set up a cold mattress at home. And these are things that people don't tell you. Did not want my baby to go to the mortuary. She was 12. So the undertaker picked her up, and the hospice nurse came out and set out a cold mattress at home. And we brought her home, and we put a do not disturb sign on the front door, because the word had gone out on social media that Daisy had died. And we surrounded her with her toys, and we put her favourite music on, and we lit some candles, and we just drifted in and out of the room as we got our heads around the fact that Daisy was no longer breathing, and yet she looked so peaceful. And for me, the most important thing, as the mother of a child who had gone through so much pain and suffering, I felt I was reclaiming that child back. She was no longer covered in tubes, she was just a little girl. And for me, it was a really important transition from that sudden moment of death to then getting my head around her being dead and dying. The next day, we took her to our children's hospice. She receives no guaranteed government funding. This is where I get really angry, because children's hospices are so essential for families like mine, don't get any guaranteed government funding. We put her on the cold mattress, and my eldest daughter, who had she was 17, she put makeup on her and put flowers in her hair and painted her nails. And she said to me, it's helping me get over Dad's death as well, just being here with Daisy. And I think there was at one point, I was sat there literally sitting next to Daisy with gin and tonic, writing out the list of who needed to speak at the funeral. And there was Daisy. And it wasn't planned in that way, and it's not very ceremonial, but it was just a moment in time where we were able to make that transition from the point of death to then the saying goodbye. I also, I'm talking about just Daisy's funeral, we're an atheist family, and so where do you go when you're an atheist but you've got lots and lots of people that want to go to a funeral? And with a child with a disability, or someone that's been ill for a long time, or someone that's very active in their community, there are a lot of people that want to say their goodbyes. I said it takes a village to care for a child like Daisy. So I asked if I could take her back to school, because school was a really important part of her life, and it happened to be half term. And the school agreed, and the thing I discovered, as long as the location agrees, you can have the funeral wherever you want. You can have the funeral in the front room. We took her little pink coffee back to school, and children from the school, from her special school, came along to Daisy's party, and we had singing, and I asked doctors to speak, and carers, and all the people that were involved in Daisy's life were able to say goodbye. And then we released 2 doves, one for Daisy and one for Andy. And these things, for the living, are so important as you say goodbye, and help me deal with time afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we've got time just for a couple of other questions. Yeah, Holly.
Okay. So this is a question linking a couple of things that were talked about earlier with, how young people are thinking about how they're living their lives, in this case with respect to liver transplants, and how it can, save someone from drinking heavily. And then kind of taking that slightly more into the transhumanist area, talking about how body modification with, in this case, synthetic, but I guess the outcome is the same with increasing the body's ability to do something or regaining that. Do transhumanists, not just looking at immortality, do they look at these body modifications and whatever else as a way of being able to live their own lives in not specifically a more hedonistic way, but in a sort of different, more improved way?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm from Oregon, but my question isn't for Seamus. I just wondered if Stephanie wanted to comment on how her experience would have been different if she'd been coping with, the 2 illnesses in her family whilst, confronted with the financial situation in the United States as it comes to medical care.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, again, this is for Stephanie. I spent my working life as a paediatric nurse, often working with children who had illnesses that were in some way life-limiting, either life-limiting or life-threatening. And one of the things that I found was that it seems to me in paediatrics that very often medical doctors and other medical staff did know when it was time to let go, and not necessarily to over-medicalise the death. And also that the children themselves often have an amazing wisdom. And I don't necessarily mean knowledge, although they often had a lot of knowledge about their condition. They also had an amazing wisdom about it that sometimes exceeded the wisdom of the adults around them. And I just wondered if Stephanie had any comment on the development of that wisdom in children, and as the children who went to Daisy's funeral seemed to show.
Thank you. Mark, perhaps you can take the first one about risk-taking and transhumanism, and then Stephanie.
Sure. Yeah. Essentially, from a transhumanist perspective, the human body is a sort of an outmoded technology. So they think of it in terms of, it's a very mechanistic way of thinking about the body and what it means to be a human being and what it means to be alive. So the body is a machine, but it's a machine that's evolved for a life, on the African savannah 200, 300,000 years ago, and it's not fit for purpose today, is how they view it. So the more that you can replace bits of it, or ideally the entire thing, the better off you'll be. And so, yeah, they want to be outside of the body entirely. There's a real sort of dismissal of the human body as essentially just meat. And so I would say transhumanists want to extract what they're interested in is purely just intelligence, really. I mean, so I'm maybe oversimplifying slightly. Not all transhumanists would agree with this. There are some people who would describe themselves as transhumanists who would say, well, I would be happy to simply live longer, or implant something in my brain that would allow me to have a better sort of cognitive capacity or whatever. But it's all underpinned, I think, by a kind of a discomfort or distaste with the condition of living in a body in the first place.
The lady from Oregon, I do not believe Daisy would have lived to the age of 12 if we had been in the US. When you have a child with a rare disease, you engage with anyone you can over the world, and I met a few people from the US who were just on their last legs trying to struggle to get the treatment for their child. And my child had the most extreme form of this rare disease. To then have my husband's cancer diagnosis, I just don't think either of them would have lived as long as they would, and I don't think I would be sitting here today in a reasonably coherent way. I'm so passionate. The NHS is like your imperfect aunt who you love and know has lots of failings, but you love them dearly, and then lots of stuff needs to be done. But I will fight tooth and nail to protect what we have, and I am so absolutely acutely aware of how incredibly privileged we are in this country to have the healthcare that we do. That gave my daughter 12 years, and I will always be grateful to the NHS for that. In terms of, children are incredible. I met on my journey so many children who had complex conditions and who died, and they do know when it's their time. And when I was working with the palliative team, looking at making plans for Daisy's death and making plans for what we wanted, we just said we know, and she will tell us because we've seen it. And in a way, she chose. She had her 12th birthday just before Christmas. She had Christmas, she had New Year, all her favourite times of the year, and then she deteriorated. It was strange, and she went very quickly. The last thing she said to me was, "Bye-bye, Mummy," and she put her iPad down and she put a blanket over herself, and not long afterwards she went into a coma, and it was almost like she was saying goodbye. I think also, the parents sometimes, there's that emotion and you want to do everything possible for your child, but sometimes you have to pull back and do the most selfless thing, because I talk about this a lot, all I ever wanted was one last cuddle, one last kiss. But actually, doing the right thing for your child is to actually say goodbye, which is, I think, why I've been quite outspoken about some of the big cases, the Charlie Gard, the Alfie Evans, because I think parents cannot make those big decisions on their own.
There's a sort of paradox, because one of the chief executives of the NHS, Nigel Crisp, said the best way to measure the quality of a health system is how people die. And yet, as Stephanie said, hospices are funded by charity. They're not funded by the NHS. And lastly, you talked about the difficulty of a funeral if you're an atheist. Well, my brother, who's a stand-up comedian, has a sideline comparing funerals, because he's kind of used to standing up. So if you want to, looking for an atheist, then so let's thank our speakers, and thank you very much.